Today we're going to be comparing some expensive overlanding equipment to some cheap overlanding equipment, including Wish.com traction boards. There are two phrases I hear a lot when it comes to overlanding gear. One is overland tax, and the other is buy once, cry once. And I don't necessarily think that either one is correct all the time. A lot of overlanding specific equipment is going to cost more, and it's because it's often something that can't be mass produced. Believe it or not, overlanding is not a huge market, and a lot of the time it's made in the US by small companies that have higher costs. When you buy something and you think it has overland tax, it's actually just the cost of doing business with small businesses. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to buy the most expensive options with the buy once, cry once mentality. Sure, more expensive equipment is usually better, but you also usually get diminishing returns as you spend more. In this video, I'm going to go over some things that I've owned both cheap and expensive and talk about which might be the best option for you. I'll put links to everything I talk about in the description, and we also sell a lot of this stuff on revereoverland.com, but just because it's on Revere Overland doesn't necessarily mean that it is your best option. Let's start with recovery gear. When buying something that's going to be under a load, you definitely don't want to cheap out, since it could be dangerous. Let's check with Mike Morrison from Morrison's Outdoor Adventures to see what you should look for in tow straps, shackles, and snatch straps when buying them.
So when we're looking at recovery equipment, there's a few things that we want to make sure that each piece of recovery equipment has with it. Number one is all of our recovery equipment needs to have a rating or a tag on it. But the ratings can be a little misleading, especially now that there's so many companies out there producing different products. What we're looking for when we're looking at ratings, especially with kind of the newer soft shackles and stuff like that in the industry, is we are looking for MBS or minimum brake strength. Some of them may say MTS or minimum tensile strength. Both of those are kind of interchangeable. Some companies are putting out that average brake strength or maximum brake strength, and those are kind of misleading numbers, kind of making them seem stronger than they really are. The minimum brake strength comes from when they pull test it, they take the lowest number of the one that broke, and that's what they rate their shackles and stuff like straps and things like that. Some of your other things like bow shackles and other things may have a WLL on it. That is a working load limit. The working load limit comes from the overhead lifting industry. That's like a safe working load limit, meaning it can continually be loaded at that weight, and it's normally a safety factor divided off of the braking strength. So I've got two soft shackles here, cheaper version versus a more expensive version. So we've got two very good examples where, like this one here, does not have any type of rating sewn into it whatsoever. So you're kind of going off based on what the company says on their website. You can also tell when you look at the more expensive one, this is an Ironman one here, not only does it give you the minimum brake strength, but it also tells you what the material is. So it's 100% basically synthetic winch line, ultra high molecular polyethylene, whereas this one doesn't tell you what it is. So it could be synthetic winch line or synthetic fibers mixed in with nylon and polyester, giving it more stretch and making it weaker as well and more likely to fail. When we look at straps, like tree straps, for example, or tow straps, not to be confused with snatch straps, normally their tags can be two different styles. This is what we call a rigging tag. So it's got a lot more information than just your standard tag, but it's still going to give you what you need. It's got, for instance, this one says MTS, vertical, so minimum tensile strength, just like that minimum brake strength, but that's the number that we're looking for. Some of them may give you a working load limit, but again, that's just a division off of minimum braking strength. So the rigging tags will give you a lot more information based on how you rig it, how that affects the rating, because if you rig it in a straight line, it's going to be stronger than if you rig it in a choker, but a basket is going to be stronger than both of those. The other type of tag that we can see is normally like ARB, Ironman, and some of these other companies that don't necessarily supply overhead lifting equipment. They may just have a tag similar to this one here sewn into the crotch, and it may just say minimum brake strength. But same thing again, looking for that minimum braking strength. When we're choosing a good tree strap, this is super important. Some things we can look for to make good quality decisions. look at the stitching and how the stitching is put together on the strap. We want the stitching to run parallel with the strap, not perpendicular back and forth where the strap's sewn together. If it's perpendicular back and forth, a lot of times that makes a much weaker strap, and it's more likely to fail.
You definitely don't want to buy your recovery boards from wish.com, and I can tell you that from personal experience. There are some other options that you can consider though. I've seen a lot of people online argue between getting MaxTrax or getting something like X-Pull traction boards. The pro MaxTrax argument is that you don't want to cheap out on something that you rely on, and I think that that's a pretty poor argument. It's not great to rely on one piece of equipment, especially since MaxTrax can break too. They're not infallible, and traction boards should just be one of several tools that you have for recovery. In fact, a winch is probably the first option you want to go with. The pro X-Pull argument is that you can buy 5 sets of the cheap traction boards for the price of 1 set of MaxTrax, and I don't think that that's a great argument either, since you really don't want to be using disposable recovery equipment, especially when they're like $60, $70 each. That being said, MaxTrax are definitely better. They grip the tire a little better, they're more flexible, and they recover their shape better. The main problem with X-Pulls seems to be the quality control. These ones that I have next to me belong to my buddy, and they broke on their very first use. You can see that it is shattered at the top. You've got a long crack going down the length of it, and almost broke completely in half, and there was a small piece that shattered off the side down here too. On the other hand, I had exactly the same set on my 4Runner, and they lasted for 3 years with basically the same use that I put my MaxTrax through, and I eventually gave them away when I switched to MaxTrax. And the only reason I switched from them to MaxTrax is that I wanted something that was easier to mount and stacked better on top of my roof. Let's check in with Mike again, since he has used a lot more different styles of traction board than I have, and he has some thoughts on them.
Traction boards, they're incredibly popular, but they're probably one of the most misused type of recovery equipment on the market. But all traction boards have their pros and cons, right? You can buy cheap ones and replace them, but they're going to be more likely to break. You can spend money on expensive ones and they're going to work better, but they are still a wearable item. Number one thing across the board with all traction boards is you do not want to spin tires on them. Even some of the more expensive ones like MaxTrax and Tread Pros, they are going to specifically say on there, do not spin a tire. So these are kind of the 2 most popular ones that I use, the Tread Pros as well as the MaxTrax. And they both have some differences. I do typically use the Tread Pros the most, and I'll kind of explain why they are kind of my favorite. The MaxTrax, what they have over the Tread Pros is you can bridge with them, but they are more likely to wear out. You're more likely to spin on them and wear the nubs off. I don't typically bridge, or if I do have to bridge, I'll put something underneath of the Tread Pros. I like the Tread Pros because they are more flexible, but they are more durable. So because they use 2 different materials, the nubs are a harder material than the actual body is. Typically they flex very well, but the nubs last a lot longer if you do have to spin, which most of what I do is on the East Coast, but even out west, mud, sand, snow, you're gonna spin a little bit, you're very likely to wear those nubs off. So I like the Tread Pros the best, but again, the MaxTrax are still a very good solution, especially if you're gonna be needing to bridge and things like that.
If buying MaxTrax means that you have no money left over for anything else, then get a cheaper set and diversify your recovery gear with the leftover money. Something like a winch is going to be a much better use of your money though. I've only ever used Warn and Smitty built winches, so do not have a lot of experience. So let's see what Mike says about winch brands.
So when you're looking to put a winch on your vehicle, one of the first things you're going to do first off is look for a bumper. And there's tons of considerations out there on the market. This really is not an area where you're going to want to skimp on price because you want a very durable bumper that's not going to tweak or tear or even just fail and come completely off of the vehicle. It's going to have to hold a lot of pressure when you're winching off of it. Some other considerations you want to think about is whether or not you want to add a full bumper with a lot of weight, or if you want some type of hideaway bumper on the front that will kind of lessen that weight. But the 2 most important things for me when I'm choosing a bumper is, outside of strength, is I want good access to the winch. I want to be able to see the drum and get access to that drum, so when I'm spooling it back on, I can spool it neat and tidy and clean. But I also want good access to the clutch because we want to be able to disconnect that clutch and free spool it out. If we can't easily disconnect that clutch, we can end up normally in a rush free spooling the winch out, and you can burn it up doing that. So always have access to the clutch of the winch and to be able to see the drum clearly. When you're choosing a winch, again, there's tons of options on the market now, and some of them get very, very expensive, and there are some cheaper winches out there, you know, Harbor Freight Apex, Badlands, Smittybilt versus Warn, Come Up, you know, just price points, right? And there's some thought processes based on what you want to purchase. I train with the Warn VR 10S, which is their cheap one, and probably well over 5,000 hard pulls on it, and it has not failed me yet. But if you're on a budget, you want to choose something a little bit cheaper. That's where like the Harbor Freight and the Smittybilts and the Badlands come in. If you're traveling in a group and everybody else is going to have a winch, it's okay if your winch fails, and you can wait until you can warranty it out. But if you're doing overlanding and traveling by yourself, now when your winch fails, you're going to be in quite the predicament, because you're going to have to look at other types of recovery options, which may take a while or may not be readily available. So you need to take those things into account when you're choosing a winch. A lot of people get worried about line speed and stuff like that. Typically, I don't worry a whole lot about line speed, because once we have a load on it, all winches are going to be fairly slow. They're not going to be a whole lot faster unless you're getting into like competition winches and stuff like that. So line speed's kind of a misleading misnomer, and slower winches are safer. So typically I do go with slower winches, especially when I'm working with clients and training and stuff like that. Choosing a rating for your winch, typically what kind of industry standard for a long time was 1.5 times the gross vehicle weight of your vehicle, or whatever the weight of your vehicle is now that we've loaded everything else on it, right? We're not overlanders anymore, we're overloaders. But now we typically have bumped that number up, and we like to see winches that are double the weight of the vehicle. Not always possible, especially if you're running a really big truck like a Tundra or a big Ram 2500 diesel or something like that. But somewhere between that 1.5 times the weight of the vehicle or double the weight of the vehicle. Easiest thing to do though is to load up all your gear, your family, your dogs, and everybody, and go to a truck stop and weigh your vehicle so you get a true weight of what that vehicle is with full fuel and everything. That way you know what to rate your winch to.
If you want to learn more about recovery, Mike teaches recovery classes and does educational tours, so I'll put a link to his website in the description. Now let's talk shovels. I've put shovels under recovery equipment, but let's face it, most of the time they're used, it's to dig a hole to take a dump. This is where things get really extreme. You can easily get a $15 mass-produced shovel from Home Depot, or you could go out and spend over $200 on a shovel from a small US-based company. I've owned more shovels than any normal person should, trying to find something that fits my needs. I started with a $15 shovel from Lowe's, but it took up entirely too much space, so I bought a $20 military fold-up shovel from Amazon, but it was far too small and flimsy. On my most recent trip, I took out the GP Factor 2-piece shovel, and I really liked it. It's solid, like the $15 shovel, and easily fits in my drawers, like the $20 shovel. You can also use the handle as a hammer or mallet, which saves me taking one of those on the trips. But the downside is that it costs $200, and that is a lot of money for a shovel. I think I've finally found something that's a nice middle ground between those two. It's something that's solid, but fits in my drawers, and it's about in the middle in terms of the price as well, and that is the Ironman 4x4 shovel. But I need to test it out a little more. So which should you go with? That's entirely up to you, your budget, your space, and your priorities. I use my shovel a lot for digging frozen snow, so I need something that's going to be strong enough to deal with that, but I also need something that fits in my drawer system, so my shovel's probably going to be a little more on the expensive end. If you're just digging poop holes, then a $20 military shovel is going to be fine. If you're digging a lot of snow like me and have space on your roof rack or on the side of your tent for a normal $15 shovel from Lowe's or Home Depot, then go with that one. Once again, there are extreme price differences in air compressors. You can get a $15 air compressor from AutoZone, or you could go out and spend $600 on a compressor with a $200 and something pressure control module from my website. Once again, there is no right choice, but this time around there's definitely a wrong choice. If you're airing up large off-road tires, you want an air compressor that hooks directly to your battery. If it plugs into your cigarette lighter, it is going to be entirely too slow. Some good examples of budget air compressors are the Viair 88P, the Harbor Freight compressor, and the cheaper Smittybilt compressor. If you're on a long trip, then I can see you airing down a lot, and it's completely understandable to want to get something that's going to be a little quicker, and the Moreflate compressors are a fantastic option. They're incredibly fast and pretty well priced. There are other similar options, but I went with the Moreflate in the Jeep since I know that they have the quality control there. It's actually very similar to the Napa compressor, but the Napa ones are very hit or miss. Finally, there are the ARB compressors. These are by far the most expensive, and they're actually a little bit slower than the Moreflate compressors. So why would I pick one of these? It's what I went with in the Tundra, and the reason is because they are the easiest to hardwire and hard mount. It's hidden away in a spot that I don't use, and I can just plug in the hose and turn it on remotely. I also have the Bluetooth control module, which allows me to set the pressure on my phone and forget about it. Once it gets to the desired pressure, it shuts off and I unplug the hose and go on my way. Lights are probably the best example of diminishing returns. A $300 light bar is 3 times the price of a $100 light bar, maybe 1.5 times the brightness. A $900 light bar is 9 times the price of a $100 light bar and maybe 3 times as good. Of course, I'm just making up the numbers here, but my point is that you will never get double the brightness for double the price when buying a light bar. You do, of course, get better quality. The cheapest light bars are going to be made out of the cheapest parts with mass-produced Chinese components. They're also going to be non-serviceable, so eventually we'll get condensation in them and they will look terrible. The mid-range lights are decent. They're usually serviceable, but are again made from relatively cheap components or without much thought in the design. There's nothing wrong with them and they'll usually do the job just fine. And for your average user who probably doesn't do a lot of wheeling at night, it's probably a good option. Once you start getting into the high-end lights, you'll have high-end components. And that's where the LEDs and reflectors are going to be custom made to work best with one another. You're going to have manufacturer-specific circuit boards that work best with those light designs. And a lot of them, like my Heretic Studio lights, are going to be completely machined and made in the US. So how much should you be spending on lights? I think that again depends on your budget and your use. There's nothing wrong with getting cheap lights, especially if they're just reverse lights or maybe something you use once or twice a year. In fact, most people don't use their lights a lot. Let's face it, we've all seen those people with their yellow Baja Designs lights on driving down the interstate in broad daylight, and that's probably the most use they're ever going to get out of them. The more you use your lights, and I mean like actually use them off-road at night, the more you can justify spending. If you're out blasting through the desert at night, you probably want to spend more so you can get that range, to get the best range that's possible. If you're crawling through the forest at night, you probably don't need a good range. You can spend a little less. That being said, I also think that rather than adding 20 cheap lights across the front of your vehicle, you're better off adding 2 expensive lights. Something like my roof rack camp lights are an easy way to demonstrate this. Just one of those Heretic camp lights puts out as much as a bunch of the cheap Chinese ones. My first few trips were out in a Walmart tent that I got at a yard sale for $15. It worked, but I wouldn't recommend doing it in anything other than the best, driest weather. I do have a $100 pop-up tent from Walmart, which I actually quite like. I've also used the Gazelle pop-up tents and I love them. They're quick, they're easy, they're reliable. And my point here is that you do not need to go out and spend $4,000 on a rooftop tent. And although you definitely don't need them, I won't deny that they are nice. If you're out on long trips and moving a lot, it could be worth spending the money on one. It's nice being able to leave all of your bedding in a rooftop tent. It's nice having that quick and easy setup. It's nice being able to camp basically anywhere with level ground without having to worry about it, whether it's rocky or sharp on the ground or have sticks and branches on the ground. And they're pretty comfortable. If you decide you must have one, It's worth getting a hard shell over a soft shell style. They're just so much easier to set up. A great video to watch that goes into a lot of depth on a bunch of different rooftop tents is the tent speed dating video from Nathan at Outdoor Auto. My personal quick summary is that I don't think you can really go wrong with a lot of the wedge style tents as long as they are long enough for you to sleep in. If you want a little more space, the bifold hard shell tents are for you, and that's the iCamper style tent. And in that case, I actually think that it's worth spending a little more on the iCamper with the rocky black shell. Pretty much all of the other tents, other brands of tents, are different variations on rebranded Chinese tents, and they all suffer from the same few issues, including that plastic shell that just doesn't last very long. It cracks and it flakes and it degrades. The iCamper is just much higher quality. The canvas is so much nicer than all the rest, and that rocky black shell stands up to the sun and the elements a lot better. If you can't bring yourself to spend that much on an iCamper, then you can go with one of the other brands, but I really recommend the aluminum shells because they're not going to break down. In your tent, you will want some kind of sleeping setup, and that usually involves a sleeping bag. I've used a cheap synthetic sleeping bag for the longest time, and it did the job for fair weather camping. If you're out in colder weather, a more expensive down sleeping bag is 100% worth it. And I have the iCamper sleeping bags and absolutely love them. I didn't realize how good a high quality down sleeping bag is until I switched from that synthetic sleeping bag to the iCamper ones. Now that I've done it, I would definitely spend the money on them again and actually wish that I had bought them sooner. First of all, they're really warm thanks to the down filling. Those of us on an inflatable mattress or a thicker rooftop tent mattress don't need as much insulation underneath, so the iCamper sleeping bag is thinner underneath. This also means that they pack up smaller or flatter if you're leaving them in your tent. They're also convertible between rectangular and mummy. I absolutely hate mummy sleeping bags, but there is no denying that they are the warmest. Because they're convertible, most of the year I just leave them as a rectangle, and then if I'm out camping in really cold weather, I can cinch it down into a mummy sleeping bag. The iCamper also has a nice collar that you can bring up around your neck to keep the drafts out, and a hood for when it gets really cold. In the summer, I just sleep on top of the sleeping bag with a nice wool blanket on top of me, and I also think that wool is worth spending a little bit of money on since it's great if the tent ends up a little bit damp. Coolers work and they are great for weekend warriors, but I am done buying ice. It's especially difficult on those summer Utah trips where you don't pass nearly enough gas stations to replenish it. The budget fridges also work. Just over 4 years ago, I bought my first fridge, which was a $300 Costway fridge. It kept my food cold and it worked, and actually still works. I gave it to a friend and it is still going strong. So why did I switch to a more expensive fridge if the budget ones work? Well, it basically comes down to more consistent cooling throughout the entire fridge and to power consumption. I've since owned 4 Iceco fridges, and with the exception of the terrible JP50 Pro, they have been great fridges. They use less power, they cool more evenly, and they have some cool features like the lids that come off completely on the VL75 Pro that I have. I do plan on switching to the Ironman fridges soon, which are a similar price to the Iceco ones, but they have a smaller footprint, and that's going to help me with the build out in the back of my truck. I'm not convinced that the Dometic and Snowmaster fridges are worth the extra price on top of things like the Ironman and the Iceco fridges, but I've also never had the opportunity to use and run them, so I could well be wrong. If you haven't seen any of my trip videos, you definitely need to hang around, and if you're enjoying this one, subscribe to the channel. My goal is to make it to 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and right now I'm not on track to reach that goal, so I need your help. If you have watched my trip videos, you know I'm probably not the best person to ask about cooking. I only really make the most basic meals, but I have seen the difference between cheap and expensive stoves. I've run a $40 Coleman stove for years, and I can comfortably say that it cooks my food. Unfortunately, the flame control is awful. There are definitely more expensive stoves that are more refined. I have since switched from the Coleman to a Jetboil Genesis, and I didn't do it because it's better, I did it to save space. But it definitely has a lot better flame control. With my Coleman, you'd turn it up and down and it wouldn't really make a lot of difference. It was one of those things that was either on or off or very on. With the Jetboil, it's definitely a lot easier to control. I can turn that flame way down low, I can turn it up really high, or anywhere in between, but I can't say for certain that it was worth the extra cost. You'll have to make the same decision. If you're a master chef, then you probably already know what you want. If you're just heating stuff up, then cheap will probably be fine for you. If you're a coffee drinker, there is one thing that I think is worth spending a little more money on, and that is the Jetboil Flash. Having used this and an off-brand version and just a stove, the Jetboil is amazing and it's worth every penny. It boils the water incredibly quickly and nothing else really comes close. We use it for pretty much anything that requires hot water, including doing the dishes and even making oatmeal for my kid. Storage is another one of those areas where there's no right or wrong answer. For years, I used cheap plastic totes in the back of my 4Runner. When I first bought my Tundra, I went back to plastic totes. They work great, but I wanted a drawer system, and I think that they're worth the money. Switching from totes to a drawer system is a huge upgrade in organization. You don't really gain any extra space, but it's so much easier to get to what you need, and it's nice when everything has a place in your vehicle. Building your own drawer system is the cheapest way to do it. It's best to spend a little more on good quality plywood if you're doing it that way though. MDF is cheap, but it is far too heavy. If you're going to pay someone else to make it, then you're going to end up spending a lot more. In SUVs, the cheapest options are going to be generic setups like the ones from Dobinson's, ARB, or Ironman, but you're going to waste a lot of space. Some of them don't have fully extending drawers, and they're often extremely heavy. If you want something that is custom fitted to your vehicle and as light as possible, you can't beat the ultralight systems from SHW Off-Road. For trucks, you only really have a few options. The cheapest and quickest to get delivered to you is decked, and if you don't care about weight or wasted space, then it's a great option. If you want something that's lighter, fully extending, and more efficient, then the SHW Off-Road is for you. It is about twice the price, but you also get about twice the usable storage space, and it's lighter and removable in about 15 minutes. And you can get to the entire drawer when you extend it. They also have the option of their half drawer, which is about the same price as the decked system, has about the same storage space, and also leaves the other half of the bed open for a fridge or whatever else you want to put in it. Having used both cheap and expensive radios, I think it's worth sticking to certain brands. These are both ham radios, and the expensive one is much clearer, has much better range, and doesn't cause or receive nearly as much interference, so it makes a much better primary radio. If you're going to go with GMRS, then it's a similar story. I don't run GMRS in my vehicles, but I can tell you from experience that while there are a few good brands like Midland, Uniden, Motorola, Midland is the most widely used, and it's worth sticking with them so that you have the same channel numbering system as other people that are on the trail with you. You're going to want to stay away from radios like this that are sold as GMRS. If you have to type a frequency into it on the number pad, it's not actually a GMRS radio, and to be able to use any of the side channels or privacy channels, then you're going to have to dig deep into the menus. There is actually another brand of radio that you should stay well away from as well. I won't name any names, but there are certain radios that are marketed as rugged, and they are just cheap, poorly made radios, similar to this one, with a sticker slapped on them, and suddenly they're double the price. So what do you get for that extra money? Well, maybe you do get a slightly better warranty, you get slightly better customer service, but for the most part, it goes towards some clever marketing and partnerships. I've actually received about 7 emails from them this year about various partnerships. Having said all of that, I actually think that cheap radios like this do have a place. If you use ham, then it's still good to have one of these radios around. If you use GMRS, then go pick up a cheap Walmart radio. They're great to hand out to friends or for spotting on the trail, because I'd much rather take this out to scout out a mud pit than my expensive radio, and that's why this one's actually covered in mud. I currently drive a relatively new truck, but had just as much fun in my older high mileage 4Runner that costs about, I don't know, a quarter of what I spent on my Tundra. So I don't think the vehicle itself matters. You can go out in what you've got now, even if that's your family's minivan, and still have a lot of fun. You just got to be aware of your limitations. What is important is spending money on maintenance. You really don't want to be getting stranded in the middle of nowhere due to an unreliable vehicle. I also think that a decent set of tires are worth having. A set of solid all-terrains are going to be a lot less likely to fail off-road than street tires. I have a few more quick-fire random things just to throw out there. Here's one of them, a $15 USB fan that I have, and I've replaced it with this, a $65 fan, and the expensive one blows better. It doesn't need plugging in, has a nice stand, and it probably wasn't worth the extra price. I bought it at Overland Expo Pacific Northwest, where it was ridiculously hot, and honestly I'm still glad I have it when it is hot. But it's a lot of money for a fan. My flashlights went through a similar upgrade. This is a $15 one that I got from Amazon. It's rechargeable, works great. But this $65 Petzl one is way better. And considering how much we use flashlights, I think it's worth the upgrade. And right after I bought this, my wife copied me and got one of her own. I've had a $100 cheap awning, I've had a $400 ARB awning, and now I have an $1,100 rugged bound 270 degree awning. The cheap awning was awful and I never trusted it in more than the lightest breeze. The ARB was much tougher, but still took just as long to set up, so I rarely used it. The 270 awning is fantastic, I love it, and I wish I could put one on my Tundra as well, because it's so quick and easy to set up. In fact, I can set it up in about 30 seconds, means that I use it all the time when I'm out in the Jeep, and I think it's worth spending extra on something that is freestanding. And while the rugged bound is definitely tough enough to be freestanding and withstand some wind, the best one that I've used so far is the Alucab awning, and I think that if I was going to buy one again, that's probably what I'd go with. Finally, there is my fire can. This is $180. Works pretty good. It's a nice focal point at the campsite, gives off okay heat, and I'd never spend my own money on it. It's not that it's a bad fire pit, it's just that I'm actually not even going to spend $10 on firewood unless there's someone else there to light it for me, because I just don't care about fire. It's not one of those things that I value at a campsite. I don't think they're worth the effort. And I know that out of the last 4 things that I've just mentioned that are sitting around me here, almost everyone out there will disagree with me on at least one of them. In fact, I bet most people would be willing to spend $10 on firewood, and I know plenty more people that would spend way more than that on a fire pit like this one, or even the $1,300 fire pit that was just released. It's a lot of money, but some people value a fire enough, even when there's a fire ban, that they're going to spend money on it. And my point is that we all have different priorities where we're willing to spend more, and others think that that's a waste of money. Just because someone else has a different priority from you doesn't mean that they're wrong. In fact, out of everything that we've covered, only really the recovery equipment is important, so that's why we spent the most time on it. If there is something that you saw in this video that you consider a priority, I put a link to it in the description, or go check out my website at revereoverland.com. If we don't have what you're looking for, give us a call and we can probably get it. Thanks for watching.